Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. And if you are new in this space, my name is Antonia Ibeziakro. I'm the Head of Education and Training for HPCA, and I also lead the HPCA NHS ED&I in Project and Change Management Network. We are a voluntary collaborative of different NHS organizations, and our mission is to create a inclusive, diverse project and change management profession within the NHS. And today I'm so excited to have with us the NATTC, and they are the Workplace Assessment, Assistive Technology Supply and Training Workplace Coaching. They've attended this webinar before, but today they've come with a different approach to what they do. And this is going to be really interesting. And I want you to be very interactive, ask questions and be open about it, because we need to have these conversations. We need to have a change that we desire. And what better way to do it than getting people who are experts in this field to come and show us how to do it. So they are an organization that thrives in making workplaces more inclusive and accessible for all employees, especially those with neurodivergent or disability conditions. And today they're taking a different twist. Like I said, they're going to talk about diagnostic and workplace needs assessment in the context of access to work. And this explores effective evidence-based approaches that have long-term impact. So today we've got Graham Huggins, who is the founder of NATTC, and we have Pete Darrett, who is the Director of Research and Service Development for NATTC. Pete is an educator and a psychologist by background. So I will hand over to Pete without further ado. Thank you very much, guys, for joining us today. Thank you.
2024 and I still can't remember to take myself off mute before I start, but thank you everybody. I hope my screen is sharing okay. Antonia, can you just give me the thumbs up to say it's doing it? Brilliant. Right, okay. So Antonia gave an absolutely fantastic description of what we are as an organization. It's almost as if we've written it and sent it to her. What we want to do today is unpick neurodiversity in the workplace. And what's particularly interesting about this is that I was saying to Antonia when we met last week, I really feel that I'm talking to my people here as somebody who's been involved in sort of project management and innovation myself. And we're talking about one of the things that is really interesting coming from a kind of medical model moving towards a social cultural model in terms of how we understand what's going on in individual difference, considering that actually our role, although we're supporting people with change, actually quite often attracts people with neurodiversity. So that's kind of where we're coming from. We will in the second half talk quite specifically. I'm going to talk hopefully for about half an hour, but I'm going to tell you now I've got dyslexia and ADHD, so half an hour in my brain is possibly about 40 minutes in real time, but I will do my very best to speak for about half an hour. I'm going to speak a little bit about the science that underpins where we're going now, and a little bit about the sort of social cultural side of where we're going as well. And about some of the adjustments that we can make, that, to be honest, the common sense, that kind of more with less approach that is particularly useful. And then Graham will talk a little bit more about access to work as a process through the Department of Work and Pensions, and explain a little bit more about what NATTC do as a company. So an hour in total is not enough time to cover everything that we would love to cover. But hopefully we can unearth some of the things that you feel are particularly useful in your roles, your workplaces, organizational change. and maybe at the end of this come to some sort of agreement about some of the small changes and large changes that can happen moving forward, just to make the world generally more inclusive and the workplace more inclusive. My starting point for this is that essentially humans, as any other biological organism, are naturally diverse, and the world that we live in is particularly diverse. From a philosophical viewpoint, we very much take that view of neurodiversity, that we are all different in some way or other, that we fit into certain neurotypes, and we're going to be exploring those neurotypes and perhaps how we have arrived at the conceptualization of where we are on that journey. But I want to start off just with a little bit of self-review. So in front of you, you've just got 8 random questions. They're not specifically designed to unpick any sort of processing or anything in particular, but I'd just like you to go through, score them up, add your score up at the end, and then maybe we'll have a bit of a chat. So I'll give you 3 minutes just to run through these. I've never actually run through them myself, and I'm going to do that, and I'm going to generate a score. Right, so I've scored 20, just running through that, but I'm feeling a bit distracted. What are we here to do? Sorry, question 6 threw me. Would anybody else, so first question, either put it into the chat or feel free to unmic yourself. There's enough of us to, is a small enough group that we should try and be interactive. So did anybody score 0?
I scored 19.
You scored 19, Antonia. See me afterwards for a diagnosis. What did we see? I saw somebody there. It's just run past me. So Caroline, 11, but you have a neurodiverse, you have your family members with that. Carolyn, what neurodiversity, are these your children or siblings? No
Yes,
need to, if you,
sorry. Yeah, 2 children, definitely autistic, possibly some other traits.
Okay. Well, we'll talk about the other traits. So you're coming from a position of well-informed. How traumatic was the autism? Have you been through an official diagnostic process with them?
Yes, with the first one, he was diagnosed at 12 after a lot of trouble at school. Looking back, there were definite signs, but it wasn't picked up any earlier. With the second one, we're on the waiting list because it's obviously enormous. But the school are just treating them as autistic, but both of them have lots of anxiety, and there's possibly some ADHD in there as well. The third one, so far, while they've got traits, seem to be not enough to be diagnosed as autistic.
Okay. And looking at the children's grandparents, who I presume come from an age where these things weren't recognised, can you spot the neurodiverse people in the grandparent generation?
I'm sorry, with our family, I only knew one of my grandparents, and she died when I was 6. But I think with my husband and I, we can pick up certain traits, and actually more so with our friends, because due to our hobbies, most of our friends are probably on the autistic spectrum.
Yeah. Are you gamers?
Yes. War games and role playing.
Yeah. And I don't wish to stereotype, but we'll talk about that. There's a specific neurotype of gamers. And does
Yeah.
anybody else have any experience, either through family or themselves, with any neurodiversities? Do feel free to just sort of chuck in. I'll take the
I
silent.
probably, can I come in? So I don't
Yes,
have any
please do.
family members, but I have a couple of people at work that
Yeah.
display this, and which is why I'm here. So I scored really low thinking at all those questions, and I thought, no, I never do it. But then I'm kind of comparing myself with who are around with me at work, and I'm kind of thinking, oh, I'm going to do this with my team members who I think are neurodiverse. I don't have a formal diagnosis, but do struggle with things around deadlines, team meetings, staying focused on the task, completing task on time. And it's not a performance issue. And that's where I've kind of landed myself always, that it's not a performance issue. But actually looking at this list has just given me some more insight of some of the other things that I probably had not thought about thinking. So for example, the online meeting, you can't, I haven't been able to judge if they are losing track because they're online and they're not in front of you. So I don't know what they're doing in the background. But things like that is a good question to ask if that is not
Well,
taking
I
them
mean,
in the right
obviously, this
direction.
isn't absolutely well, and thank you for saying that. I mean, this isn't a formal screening tool. This is just an introduction to the session, and we can talk about sort of screening and diagnostic pathways later. But what you've described is exceedingly common, and I think as you start to unpick it and unpick the complexity, and not make the assumption that everybody has been diagnosed through their journey up until this point, and that's partly what I hope we can unpick today. So thank you, Sophia. That's really interesting insight, and I'll keep coming back and picking up it. And thank you for saying that the questions have provoked a little bit of thinking, and feel free, we can maybe have a good discussion afterwards how we can maybe help you and your team just gain a bit of insight, because insight is everything. So we've arrived at a place where particularly the education system has evolved to what it is, with the best intentions. But I want you to imagine this scenario based around physiology and sporting excellence. Some people are built like sprinters. They have a strong skeletal frame. They put on muscle mass, which generates a huge amount of power over a very short distance. Some people are marathon runners. They're built for endurance. They have a lighter skeletal frame. They have physiological adaptations in terms of the size of their lungs. And their muscle mass is built for endurance. It's much lighter, but it generates energy over a much longer period of time. So we have power versus sustainable energy. Now imagine we created a world where we thought, right, actually what we're going to do is we're just going to get everybody to run 800 meters. So we're going to measure everybody over 800 meters. Well, the sprinters would probably do okay. They would be appearing in the bunch. They would be able to largely keep up. But because of the nature of their power over a short distance of time, they're going to be exhausted at the end of 800 meters, and that's going to impact them as they go forward. The marathon runner, on the other hand, is probably going to struggle to keep up with the 800 meter pace, but they can keep going for hours. So I want to start off with this conceptualization of a world, a society that we've created where we're actually measuring everybody over a very small number of specifics, and how measuring them with that specific excludes people at different ends of a spectrum. I might delve into a little bit of statistics as we go. So The education system generally throughout the world, because of the most efficient way of getting most people through, and if you think about most examination systems in the world, pass rates sit at around 60%. And if you think that, you know, one standard deviation away from average is around 60%, we're measuring the bulk of people in doing that, but we are excluding some people even because they can do better or not, and we're measuring over a very specific sort of set of parameters. We also have a tendency to measure process because at the end of the day we're trying to get to an outcome that is measurable as quickly as possible. We have to move people through because it's cost efficient to try and get everybody through by the age of 16 or 18. And that doesn't necessarily mean, so we have all this content that we think we need to get through, but that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody is moving at that pace. There is an awful lot, and it is changing, but there is an awful lot of just do what I show you to do, replicate it. Things are very right or wrong. And there's this reliance on the 3 R's. Now, as a dyslexic, the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic, was a challenge for quite a long period of time. I might be a bit of a pedant, but in the reading, writing, and arithmetic, I can only see one word that begins with an R, but yeah, I'm a pedant, I understand, which is why project management is part of my thing. But when we actually think about what the workplace needs, we need people that can solution. And we particularly need, in change management, project management, we particularly need people that can solution, can see blockers, can come up with ways to resolve those blockers, can see the way that we've always done it this way, and see how that can be fine-tuned to be better. We can look for the patterns in that, for the detail. We need to be innovative. And we need to communicate all of those. When we actually think, and this is based quite significantly on the World Economic Forum 21st Century Skills. These are the things that, and Sophia nailed this, I think, to some extent when you said this isn't a performance issue, because probably what you're seeing in the people that you're talking about is their ability to observe, their ability to innovate, their creativity, their ability to come up with solutions. And they've actually then been measured on some 800-meter kind of performance parameters that we have in the workplace, which aren't performance issues. They can be adapted for. I thought this was wonderful. So I'm afraid, Antonia, I've stolen this. But I just want to tie this into where we're going, because embracing diversity and inclusion in the community that you are fits exactly with that. Creativity, innovation, productivity, collective opportunity. It's about value for money and making sure that we get the best out of everybody that we can work with. And the best in the job we do is that solutioning, innovation, creativity. So when I saw this, I just thought, this value statement is my value statement, and that maximize return on investment, deliver improved patient outcomes as an organization, that's what we are focused on as well. So we have the same value systems. Now, increasingly, we're starting to see that on top of the values that I've said are particularly important in the workplace, and you've probably heard some talk about neurodiverse strengths, we're seeing an increased dialogue about positive discrimination in some environments in favour of people with neurodiversities. And there are a variety of reasons for that. But we do see a high percentage of, for example, engineers that are dyslexic, engineers that have ADHD, engineers that have autism. And when you think about the very intelligent, probably verbally very strong, very good with their hands, very good with practical things, but excluded from some reason from other elements of learning, they have a tendency then to go down the DT route or, something like that, because that's where they excel. People with autism, when trying to explain what they do particularly well in their workplace, good, logical, science-based decision making. Risk taking, and I don't mean risk taking in terms of impulsivity, I mean risk taking in terms of confronting the schema of we've always done it like this, when we've got so many ways of being more efficient now, and we need to use those approaches. Organizations like GCHQ and BEAE, dealing with massive amounts of information, in which pattern recognition is really important, actually particularly approaching positively discriminating neurodiverse female talent. Dyslexia talked about very often with entrepreneurship, but it's not just dyslexia, and we'll talk about the fact that we're still dealing with sort of categories here. Dyscalculia, maths learning difficulty, again, that creativity side of things coming through very strongly. So when we try and marry what we want in the modern workplace with what actually matters, what the skills are, and actually then that some people who have been excluded from the 800-meter race of the education system have a lot to offer, that's where we need to start sort of conceptualizing where we came from. So I do want to speak about the big five. These aren't all the neurodiverse conditions, and there's quite a lot of discussion, which I don't particularly want to get into, about what actually constitutes them now. So we have ADHD. ADHD is around inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsiveness. Those are the kind of diagnostic criteria, but actually people can manage those but still have significant issues with other areas. So working memory, which is the how much information you can hold in your head and work with at any one time. Inhibitive control, so the ability to go down a rabbit hole of research when you're supposed to be doing something else. So one small element of what you're working at suddenly becomes particularly interesting, losing that. And automaticity, and I'm going to talk about automaticity particularly in more detail in a minute. And so those are the domain specific, and this sort of recognizing the difference between domain specific and domain general is something quite important. So domain specific is the actual neurological presentation that we see that is specific to that condition. Domain general is what we tend to see working across all the neurodiverse conditions. So domain general, executive function, which is things like choosing the right thing to do, organization, and then particularly, and you will notice a trend going through this, when we get to people that have maybe just one diagnosis, but they've got other presentations or have no adult diagnosis, we often, very often, see a mental health impact, and quite a significant mental health impact, because people are feeling that they have to mask and maybe are feeling some shame. So next one, dyslexia, phonological processing. So that's noticing the difference between sounds. So when somebody is trying to get you to pronounce a word, struggling to then hear that and pronounce it, or the relationship between the symbols, the graphemes that we use that represent sounds for words, and the actual sound that you make that. So phonological relationships. The other thing that is quite strong in dyslexia is visual targeting of words. So actually how you can, your eyes provide information to your brain that allows you to unpick what you're actually seeing. and it's quite complex, and the domain general is consistent. Dyscalculia is considered to be a maths learning difficulty. It mainly impacts arithmetic, has quite a significant impact on other aspects of life, things like travel, time management, financial management. I would argue that although dyslexia is diagnosed more often, and about the same percentage of the population have dyslexia, slightly smaller with dyscalculia. So about 9% with dyslexia, it's about 9–10% with ADHD, it's about 7% with dyscalculia, it's about 6% with dyspraxia, and it's 1% for autism. There's a huge amount of co-occurrence. So dyscalculia is magnitude processing, essentially understanding the magnitude of numbers and the way that we describe magnitudes of numbers, and so that can include things like processing time. Dyspraxia is generally thought of as fine motor coordination difficulty, but actually has quite a strong impact on cognitive coordination, and autism is generally considered to be a social communication, both receptive in terms of bringing on board information. So again, it's a bit of a stereotype. It's not a universal, but understanding sarcasm is one of those things that we quite often use as to unpick that social communication thing. And again, cognitive flexibility. So we have the domain specific, and then we have these domain general, which usually relate to executive function. So that's the ability to maintain attention, choosing the right things to do, memory systems, so embedding in memory, unpicking from memory, remembering what you've read, remembering what you've heard, that kind of thing. So in terms of how neurodevelopmental or neurodiverse conditions arrive, we aren't there yet, but we are definitely starting to recognize certain genetic profiles that give us a very strong indication of the risk of the development of neurodiverse presentations. We're a little way away, probably about 5 years from creating polygenic risk scores for the neurodiverse conditions, but we're working on it. And we definitely are confident that there are predispositions genetically to the conditions. Then there's a whole range of things that can happen in terms of cognitive development, in terms of how our brain structures, how our brain architecture actually forms, and in the same way that we have slightly different sized hands, our brains can develop in slightly different ways, and different parts of the brain that handle different processing can develop in different ways. Then we have the impact of birth and early development. Prematurity, for example, because that then impacts on cognitive development, but carries its own risks. We recognize as being a particularly strong risk of people developing neurodevelopmental conditions moving forward. So we're building up this sort of kind of things, actions, points in our life that can have an impact. Then access to learning and how that learning is presented, and I mean that can be as different as if you're in India and your home language is Tamil, and so you learn to count in Tamil, and then you go to an English language school, and so you're at age 5 presented with suddenly doing maths in the English language. All of that just has more cognitive load. And if you have a predisposition to challenge, then so there's a whole range of things that access to learning, and it's much more complex than the quality of the teacher, but it's also as simple as the quality of the teacher in the school that you're in. And then we have well-being and emotions, and how we construct the world, and how our emotional schema relate to the experiences we had. And all these we have the risk, but they can be either mitigated or enhanced by the level of nurture, trauma, whether we're talking about sort of attachment traumas early in life to PTSD. These can all impact or enhance the risks, we have a very strong element of privilege. I was diagnosed in the late 1970s with dyslexia, and I will say without a shadow of a doubt, there was a huge amount of white middle class privilege that allowed that to happen. Now, nothing was done about the diagnosis of dyslexia, but I hear an awful lot of people saying nothing has been done about their diagnosis of other conditions now. So we haven't moved on in the very long time since I was 14 in the late 1970s. And then the skills that you acquire that actually help you to move on. So Sophia, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring a reflection in the room,
Please do. Yeah.
just sort of looking at the continuum that you just described, and just wondering from a workplace, when you're challenged with new skills to acquire, you may have not realized your neurodiversity up until you've been challenged to acquire new skills or ways of working that almost challenges you, and it becomes more apparent. And I don't know if that's an experience for adult age diagnosis, where it's those situations that have triggered it.
So through our work, we're working with a lot of people in professional roles with later life diagnosis. And what is coming through quite consistently is, for example, they did okay at school. So when you're talking to them, you realize that actually there are significant skills and significant abilities to unpick knowledge. But because of the school system, they were very much middle of the, so they were the middle of the hump on the 800-meter race. But putting an awful lot of work in to actually sustain that. And I think this is where, or actually, I mean, one of the things particularly for me, and I still hear this now, and it's still, children are still referred to this, that I look back at my school reports, I was lazy, I wasn't putting enough effort in, all of those kinds of things. I'm a marathon runner. I was struggling to keep up. It wasn't that I was lazy, I was doing all I could, but I just couldn't keep up. And I think that is draining when it's not recognized, when there isn't an official diagnosis. That becomes very draining. And so many people I talk to in their 30s, 40s, 50s and older kind of feel that they've struggled all the time. Nobody's noticed, and all that's happened is people tell them they're lazy, they're not doing it the right way. And that takes a massive impact on your sense of self and your self-esteem. And I think that's one of the primary benefits of a later life diagnosis. We might touch on that. I'm aware I need to crack on, Sophia, so but thank you. That was a really good question. It gave me an opportunity to come up with that observation. So I just wanted to talk, because this was some work we did with a veterinary surgeon, and I think it was quite an interesting one, because I just want to explain this idea of automaticity more generally, but I'm going to talk about it in terms of fine motor coordination. So obviously, when you're learning the skills that you need to do something that requires a lot of manual dexterity, like surgery, you practice it, and over time you practice it, and you develop this ability to do something without thinking about it. So for an example, if I asked you what 2 times 2 is, I am sure you would all automatically go, well, that's 4. You haven't actually consciously thought about it. It's just intuitive. It just bounces through to the front of your mind. If you're counting it on your fingers now, again, see me at the end. But that automaticity we do in everything we do. Driving's a really good example. If you drive, when you first get in the car, turning the wheel is something that you actively, consciously have to do. When you've sort of been driving for a little while, you get from A to B whilst listening to the new Lana Del Rey album, very happily singing along to all the lyrics and maybe remembering some of the lyrics without really thinking very much about the driving. So we develop this automaticity, and what happens is when we develop automaticity, we take all the pressure off our working short-term memory. That load is reduced because we've got that, and that allows us to keep going. So what we're looking at with all the neurodiverse conditions, when we went through those domain general and those domain specific areas, is that what we have with people with neurodiversities have inefficiencies in those areas, so that it takes them longer to develop automaticity. Okay, so they're not automatically comfortable working out how to organize their work to give the output that you require in a certain time frame, because they just lack that automaticity. Now, so really important, neurodiversity is actually about the efficiency or the inefficiency with which you have a domain specific component. If you struggle to develop automaticity, perhaps because you struggle with inattention or impulsivity when you're developing the skills, or because it takes you longer to develop the automaticity, you are also starting to have an anxious relationship, an anxiety relationship with what you're trying to do. And anxiety will use your working memory, will use some of your working memory capacity to tell you that you can't do this at the moment, or you be careful, you don't want to muck this up again. So we end up in this vicious circle here where we get this inability to do something, we feel shame, we become frustrated, so we mask. In other words, by masking, we try to do everything we can so that people don't notice we're struggling, because we're worried about being judged. Okay, so we mask, we avoid, we repeat, and the cycle just goes on, and people don't develop that automaticity. So what we've got to do is essentially guide ways, is to understand what their challenge is and then guide them towards developing automaticity. I'm not going to talk about this in any great depth because I'm conscious of the time, but I did want to now draw out, I've talked about the individual conditions. We now realise that those are actually fairly inaccurate. The current clinical categories don't adequately describe the challenges that we see. So if we think of Venn diagrams, they kind of overlap each other. So we're moving away from traditional psychometric measurements of small numbers of variables to a much more complex, because we can do this using machine learning, artificial intelligence, and NATTC. We've got a project on working quite closely with Aston University and a couple of other universities on it. But we're looking at ways that we can sort of build towards now strengths and challenges, common areas of need and effective support, because poor old Bob might have a diagnosis of dyslexia, because he went to university, and actually it's quite easy to get a diagnosis of dyslexia at university, but almost impossible to get any other diagnosis. So, but he's sitting in this really complex position where he's got traits of all the other conditions as well, and those aren't being recognised in his presentation. And so we've arrived at this point where we recognise that the medical clinical category model is a bit disingenuous, because it's leading us to assume if you're autistic, you're only autistic, therefore you're like Shelby from the Big Bang Theory. So it kind of perpetuates some of the bias rather than challenges some of the bias. And as change makers, challenging the bias is really important. So language of diversity of cognition, of neurotypes, the positive way of moving forward on this is that we need to look at strengths and challenges. And again, Sophia, you described this really well, and Carolyn, I think, in terms of recognizing some of the other challenges that your children or presentations that your children might have, but that we need to look at what people are really good at and the areas that they have challenges, because we need sprinters and marathon runners in the workplace. we need to recognise that this is about efficiency. It's efficiency of processing across a specific domain, and if we can support that, then we can. We need to recognise that whilst we are all different, we are actually more the same than we would like to say. So what works for one will often work for others. We've got the domain general and the domain specific aspects, and we must remember that these things overlook. Now, there are 2 links there to academic papers and to a research network, of which coincidentally I'm part of, that is doing quite a lot of work on this. Just want to say, I think we might have somebody from NHS Scotland here. We have an event, the Specific Learning Difficulties Research Network, which is based at St Andrews, and School of Medicine at St Andrews has is doing a lot of work with NHS Scotland, but I think we've got an event in March, which if you're in NHS Scotland, it would be great to come and get to. It's only a small event, but it would be really interesting. And it's about how we actually sort of manage the route to market for innovations in this. And by innovations, we're not necessarily talking about software solutions or inventions. We're quite often talking about working practices and things. So the route to accessibility. So we need an intelligent, strengths-based, data-driven assessment. So we need a strong evidence base, reliable evidence base to understand what somebody's challenges are. Then we need to be recommending what that person needs in the context in which they work and in the context of their potential cognitive inefficiency, not just saying, oh, you're dyslexic, you need a coloured overlay, which is where we were to some extent 15 years ago. I think it's probably 15 years ago. I've been around for quite a long time, but we definitely went through a phase with that, and some of you as parents might recognise that. We need strategies as well as tools. So we need to move away from the we will give you a piece of software and everything will be okay. We actually need to coach people, support people, whether that's formal or informal. So what we do, we need greater awareness. And we would love to work with you guys in any way that we can to create awareness, because to be frank, as I said, in the kind of roles that you do, you will find you probably have slight overrepresentation of neurodiversity. We need collaborative conversations across organizations, and we need to manage the mental health. We need psychological safety. And I can't speak from experience for the NHS, but having worked in education, the one thing that I think I particularly noticed is, and spoken to a lot of people in healthcare, that the 2 organisations that you would imagine to be all over things like neurodiversity, the 2 professions, are actually education and healthcare. The 2 that have the most interaction with neurodiversity are probably the worst at managing it for their own staff. So what do we need to do? How do we come up with a solution for this? So the first thing is that what a lot of people with neurodiversity will say is, don't ask me what you can do to support me, because I don't know the answer to that question. We have tools that can help that person to know the answer to that question, but more importantly, you need to have a dialogue with them where you say, okay, together, can we work out what support you need to excel? So don't expect them necessarily to know, because they don't know what's available, and it changes between organisations. You can shift between trusts and get a completely different offer. Flip between teams and get a completely different offer. So in terms of the types of assessment, so workplace needs assessments are usually the first interaction, either run through occupational health or through an external provider like ourselves. So what the workplace needs assessment is, it's not diagnostic. What it tends to look to is to cover any of the challenges in the workplace and come up with solutions with how to manage that. So it will cover any challenge to work, and the idea is that it will come up with maybe ergonomic or software coaching solutions. Not diagnostic in any way. in some ways, it's not looking at the condition or disability that somebody has, it's taking on board the known solutions. It does have a tendency at times, workplace needs assessments, if you build them cheap and pile them high, you will get very generic, as Graham calls it, vanilla offerings. They're not personalized, and that's why I stress the need for personalized. They are, okay, you've got dyslexia, we will put this software which costs £900 onto your device and everything will be better. And it doesn't, it just sits in a cupboard, so it's a waste of money. And none of us like a waste of money, so they build them cheap and they are always inefficient. Screening is the next step of the diagnostic process, and this doesn't provide a diagnosis, but it identifies the probability of one or more conditions. So quite often it's checklists not dissimilar to in sort of ideation to what I gave you at the start, but it's kind of telling you what the best route forward maybe is in terms of diagnostic. And then the diagnostic assessment is the one that actually gives you a diagnosis of one or more conditions. Again, we see some challenges in this because, to give the NHS the clinical diagnostic example, ADHD tends to be run by mental health service, autism tends to be run by a different part of the mental health service. The two don't talk, but there's often an awful lot of overlap in terms of the presentations. So that's a challenge. And then non-clinical assessment, which tends to happen for the specific learning difficulties, dyslexia, dyscalculia, dyspraxia, we have a tendency for over-diagnosis or over-recognition of dyslexia and under-recognition of the other conditions. So it's not perfect, and that's one of the reasons we need to move away to a new diagnostic category. Our preference at NATTC, we would always advise people to go for clinical assessment for ADHD and autism, and non-clinical because they're not medical diagnosis, they're psychology diagnosis for the other conditions. Particularly for ADHD and autism, in adults, one of the reasons for a clinical assessment is because it can inform mental health interventions if they have a mental health challenge. So some of you may have picked up that there is quite a lot of discussion about people's first diagnosis of psychiatric conditions, personality disorders, for example, and then it turning out that their initial presentation was autism, and it's their unmet autism that has given them the personality disorder, has created the challenge that has given them that. So by making sure that the diagnosis of their neurodiverse condition is on their medical records, that will inform later clinical practice, can prevent inappropriate diagnosis, and more particularly drive towards more effective interventions, saving money. In terms of the adjustments we can make, we have soft adjustments, which are personal strategies, which we can identify by coaching. We have soft adjustments, which I call environmental. Those are kind of the things that you might want to discuss with your team about just how you manage things. And those are the ones that actually, when you hit on the right things, they might have the most impact for the person that you're doing it with, but they have some impact for everybody. We have supporting technology, we have ergonomics. I want to just give you 4 or 5 very quick case studies of these kinds of adjustments as they go, and I'm sure as we go through these you might recognize some people. So we have somebody whose strengths are systems thinking, verbal communication. They find it particularly difficult thinking on the spot, and when they're having to do lots of things, like they're listening to people, they're taking notes, they're doing all the things that you have to do in the meeting, that dual tasking impacts their processing. How can we solution those? So if they work in an environment in which meetings quite often run back to back, but the meetings for 25 minutes or 50 minutes instead of 30 minutes. And practically speaking, we know that they might well overrun, but the intent is to end it 5 minutes early so that we actually give people some detox time and prepare some questions. So make sure that if you're going to ask them questions, they know what the question is likely to be moving forward. Eye for detail, pattern recognition, challenges with social interaction, taking minutes. Give them buddies for meetings if they're face-to-face meetings. Have somebody in the team that can be with them, can meet them, can just keep them talking very gently, just keep them in the zone so they're not becoming anxious. Transcripts of meetings. I know there are challenges around what we can do using AI in different workplace environments, but the IT teams in all environments are starting to come up with solutions. We've moved beyond the no, we can't do that to how do we do that. Crisis management, adaptability, their challenges with pain management and tiredness. Allow them to work from home where you can. Provide ergonomic workstations. So hopefully the message is that, you know, we can work through all of these. There are text prediction software. There is mapping out do not disturb time. All of these things, very easy ways of doing this. And I've gone over, and I know I've gone over because I do. In terms of the leadership, just remember that 800-meter analogy. Everybody runs that in different ways. Everybody can achieve. Adapt to strengths, not challenges, and just that if we can keep people out of work, in work, and not off with mental health, value for money for the organisation. It's simple. Graham, do you want to hop in and just sort of tell the NATTC story, and you were going to mention a little bit about access to work?
Yeah, thanks, Pete. That was brilliant.
You've never actually seen me do this, have you?
Yes, quite a bit of it, but in different, slightly different way.
Yeah, I do a lot of this, Graham. Yeah,
it certainly kept me interested. I must admit,
good.
I've learned a little bit more about myself, and along the last hour.
Good.
Do you want to? You've got a couple of slides for me, haven't you?
I've just got our story. Oh, yeah. Shall I give you that one?
Yeah. Where's the access? Have you got the access to work one, or is that it? I can go with either. Doesn't matter.
That's the access to work one.
Oh, okay. Right. Okay. So one quick question. Because I'm not going to go into detail. We've already done one about access to work and detail, and we can always do another one, and I can help anyone out. But does anyone know about access to work? Are you all aware of access to work? Few nods, few. Okay. So access to work is run by Department of Works and Pension. It's for individuals to get more than reasonable adjustments in the workplace. They can get quite considerable grants, up to £64,000, but I'd say for someone who's neurodiverse, then the average to what we see is around £3,500 to £5,000 worth of assistive technologies, anything from speech to text, text to speech, AI, note taking, remarkable notepad, so you can look at a note-taking strategy. It's not just about one single bit of technology, and it's also not just about technology, it's about workplace coaching strategies to help you with sort of note-taking or time management, organizational skills, stress, overwhelm, concentration, even to mind mapping technologies, help with report writing, spelling, grammar, punctuation, and all the training that can be associated with that. It's not just throw some technology at somebody. It's about building a strategy to help them in the workplace. So, as I say, assistive technology, training, workplace coaching, and also awareness training around the individual, around the team they work in, strengths, challenges, to the people that they touch within their environment, in their working environment, so that the team that they work within can understand them and they can understand each other. So it's about enabling people to thrive in the workplace. Unfortunately, there are 2 or 3 downsides to it. So it's a great opportunity to get some help. And if you're going to start a new job, then apply before, because as soon as you apply, you go on a 24, as soon as you start for the new company, so apply before. Unfortunately, when you start and anybody else within the business, you're going to wait 24 weeks until you get an advisor. If you apply before, you'll see someone in 6 weeks because they prioritize things. And this is not just for neurodiversity, it's for all disabilities under the Equalities Act 2010. So it can even cover things like support workers or taxes or lots and lots of other things. We provide a free service that allows people to be helped along that process. So we often find that form filling is extremely difficult. I must admit, I found that myself, and we built the service around initially my frustrations and what I saw from a training perspective, where people could be waiting up to 2 years. And this is people in the NHS, councils, and a whole host of other things, because nobody really knew what they were doing. Nobody really supported them within the business. And this could have been HR, IT. You often find that once you had the holistic assessment, sorry, it's not, as far as I'm concerned, an assessment, as it's only 30 to 40 minutes. And I'm unsure how they can collect all the information that they need in that time and actually provide you with what it is you're going to need to get supported in the workplace. We take a completely different approach. As Pete mentioned earlier, we've created a tool that helps us understand how we can help the individual, and the line manager or a colleague can also fill that in. They don't have to, it's up to the individual because everything's confidential. And that helps us help them on that journey. And we know that no one else has got a tool like that in the market. Basically, based on all of Pete's experience, as he's just given there, we've simplified things and made them easy. So we use that as part of the process to help you understand what's actually required. Now, we do recommend a workplace needs assessment, because that can give you and the individual a fully costed, valued report with all the recommendations, the reasons and recommendations behind that, to actually use simply with Access to Work to request. And all the ones that we've worked with organisations with have been very successful. And I can name some very large trusts that have done that, and councils, amongst other organisations like lawyers and banks and things. We do that all the way through to the end. So we don't just leave you at the point of, well, there's your advisor. We can come and advocate. I've sat in on many a meeting. Things can still go wrong if we do it the free way and we just give advice, because people get really confident in thinking they know what they want, even if they have a quote. But then when they try to articulate that to the advisor, they're often thrown down the road of an assessor. And again, that assessor, I won't go into politics now, but that assessor doesn't tend to give them what they want. And to the extent where we often see equipment being purchased, unable to use it in that workplace for various reasons, and then never used. It gets put in the drawer. The person doesn't get supported. They don't get that note taken or something that would have helped them. All the way through to giving them the assisted training, supplying the equipment, and the workplace coaching. And the workplace coaching is not just about working strategies. It can help with emotional dysregulation or RSD, if it happens to be ADHD, or anything around autism with maybe communication, mentoring. They might not be able to feel confident and be able to travel between A and B if they need to do that as part of work. I've actually mentioned quite a few of our services amongst this. I mean, our services begin right at the beginning by helping with diagnosing, whether that be specific learning difference on dyspraxia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, or dyslexia, through to triaging in respect to ADHD and ASC, so autistic spectrum condition, and we have a unique offering in respect to blue light industry and Ministry of Defence. We started trialing it last November, and it's been very successful, the MOD. And we've got a partnership through the RTC programme. So we write a report, do an assessment, triage, write a report, included in that is reasonable adjustments. It's the first step of a workplace needs assessment, really. So we're looking at maybe the well-being or the counselling. If there's something critical that individual needs help with straight away, we will mark that as a recommendation. And then the actual ADHD triage report gets sent to the GP. It has to be NHS England. We are working with Wales and Scotland to come up, and Northern Ireland. And we've got a plan A and plan B, which we're trialing with the MOD at the moment to get through their procurement, and then through the helping them through to the surgery. The actual the bit that is a difference, so you postcode lottery, it could be in Bristol it's around, I think it's 3 years in it, Pete, at the moment, or was it longer? I can't remember. It was only 3 months ago. My dyslexic brain has now gone out the window.
ADHD's 7 years.
Yeah.
Avon and Wiltshire Trust.
Right, yeah.
And
I never actually asked the question to my GP. I just gave him the...
Sorry to interrupt, Graham. I'm just very conscious of time. People are having to drop out.
Yeah. So just to finish that, the diagnostic assessment, once the GP has sent it to our partner, is 3 weeks. So you get a diagnostic assessment roughly in around about, I would say, anything between 4 and 6 weeks. And that's all funded by the NHS, by this local ICB. And we've not had one issue yet with taking back after titration. I'll summarise and say any more questions, or we've got a whole host of information on the website, and you're welcome to call me anytime. Or Pete. That's it. I'm done.
Thank you very much, Pete. Thank you, Graham. Much appreciated. Thanks, everyone, for joining.